Honestly, I think what most people from the school system need is everything else to be fixed. That's actually why I will sometimes make the case against giving free things to kids that have already got food in favour of doing other stuff. Because actually, I think the biggest barriers now to social mobility, to children's wellbeing, lie outside of schools. Housing, poverty, labour markets, dentistry. Hard to learn at school when your parents can't take you to the dentist and your mouth is absolutely, stunken with pain.
Hello, and welcome to this edition of the IFS Zooms In. I'm Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and this week we're going to be looking at the Schools Bill, which is currently going through Parliament. The bill, which has the full title, the Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill, covers children's social care and education. Now, the aim of the bill, as stated on the House of Commons Library website in any case, is to improve the safeguarding of children and to raise educational standards. That doesn't really tell us very much about what's actually in it, and indeed why there's quite a lot of controversy about it. So today, we're going to be focusing on what it says about schools in particular, and why there is some of that controversy. To look at this, I'm joined by Laura McInerney and Luke Sibieta. Now, Laura, who is a teacher, or was a teacher, was also the founding editor of Schools Week, and now co-runs Teacher Tapp, a regular online survey of teachers. Luke is a research fellow here at the IFS who specialises in education and has written an enormous amount about schools, school funding and outcomes in schools. Before we dive into the intricacies of the bill that's going through Parliament at the moment, perhaps it's worth just spending a couple of minutes on what's happening in schools in England. And this is really very much going to be about England, I think, this discussion. Luke, I think the general sense is that of all of the public services over the last 15 years, schools have probably done, should we say, the least badly in terms of their performance over that time, at least in the sense that on international measures, we seem to have at least held up and maybe even moved up the league tables. Is that a fair sort of very, very broad level assessment of what's happened in schools over the last significant period?
Yes, generally speaking. I think there's a lot of noise around the schools bill and schools performance. If you listen to one side of the argument, the schools are failing in England, we've had 10, 15 years of underinvestment, inequalities are going through the roof. On the other side of the argument, you'll be hearing arguments like children in England are the best readers in the West, and we've had a huge amount of improvement over the last 10, 15 years thanks to certificate education reforms. The truth is probably a bit more boring, in that schools in England are doing okay. Average performance hasn't changed that much over the last 10, 15, 20 years. Inequalities are about where they were 10, 15 years ago. England's doing better than most other countries and has improved its relative ranking. But that's mostly because other countries have got worse rather than England's got better. So I think it's fair to say that England's avoided policy mistakes and done okay, but it's still not amazing.
I mean, you've done a fair bit of work suggesting that maybe Wales and Scotland have made some policy mistakes and have got a bit worse.
And they're probably not unique in international terms. There are lots of countries who have chosen curriculums that are on the same par as Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, a sort of skills-based curricula that emphasises wider skills and experience rather than specific elements of a curriculum. And that includes places like Finland, New Zealand, some parts of Canada, France, and they've all seen relative declines in their skills on most international surveys in recent years. England hasn't, and that's probably a good thing.
But I think so.
It's a good thing in relative terms, but England still hasn't seen huge amounts of actual improvement in skills. If you look at GCSEs, they're kind of like static for like 5-6 years before the pandemic, and then have been relatively static once we've gone back to normal marking schemes as well.
I've always found it very hard to interpret what GCSE results are telling us, given that they don't seem to be measuring the same thing over time. But maybe I'm being overly cynical there. Laura, do you broadly agree with Luke's summary there?
Yeah, I think that's right. That I would probably summarise it as the schools are doing well, but the kids are not okay. And just on the GCSE point, we've had a regulated exam system since 2010. So the aim has been to flatten out the GCSE results. And that has meant it's more difficult for us to see if things are getting better or not. But there is a national reference test, which is taken each year to try and check. Now, last year was the record low for English scores, but we've not been doing it for very long. And there is always natural variation in certain cohorts. So we still just don't really know how much academic performance at the national level has changed on our GCSEs. But exactly as Luke said, if you look at the international league tables, we have been doing much better than we were doing, although because others have gone down. However, what's more concerning to me is if the schools are holding up, and they probably are actually, does that mean that the children are better off? And when we look at some of the other statistics, for example, the growing concern around attendance and the fact that unauthorised absences are now 80% higher in secondary schools than before the pandemic, and that in lots of these international surveys, they don't just get kids to do English and maths tests, they also ask them a bunch of questions. And some of those questions are about their well-being. And for years now, we've been getting worse and worse and falling behind on how happy and how anxious our children are. So the schools are doing all right, but are the kids?
That is really quite disturbing if our kids are getting worse in terms of well-being. I mean, to what extent would we understand what's happening there? I mean, what is driving that? I mean, that really is quite concerning.
It is. It's tricky because there are cultural norms around how you answer these questions, and also there are language barriers. So how you ask about things like happiness and anxiety in different questions can mean culturally different things. But we do seem to be having a problem with our teenage girls that has been continuing to go up. And we can see it in various different metrics, including referrals and through the NHS as well. So there is certainly something happening. We just don't know how much that's related to schools' policies. And some people will say it's because we've gone down a very academic, traditional curriculum review process, which has kept us in those league tables, but might be making some children unhappy. Others would point to many different things. For example, social media, the rise of devices, children spending less time outside, us talking more about anxiety and well-being and more awareness.
That issue of teenage girls being referred to NHS mental health services is astonishing. I can't remember the numbers, but it's a very high fraction who have ended up feeling so anxious that they've ended up being treated or being referred to NHS mental health services. And it's important in all of this conversation to distinguish, as you say, things seem to be going okay in terms of academic results, but if that is alongside or even at the cost of this falling well-being, that's really concerning. But you particularly mentioned there, Laura, the sort of what's happened post-pandemic in terms of attendance at schools. This kind of 80% increase, I think you said, in lack of in non-attendance, which is huge. Is that something again that we understand? Is that something in your view is likely to be permanent?
So since the pandemic, the absence rate across the country has gone from about 4.5% to nearly 7%. And the persistent absent rates, this is children who miss a lot of school, has doubled. Now, we have seen it come down a bit, but it's not come down quickly enough. It's still a fair bit above, as I've just said there. And so it does seem to be a shift that, if not permanent, is going to be very, very slow. Now, this did actually happen after World War I. So in World War I, the country had got up to about a 90% attendance rate in its schools. And then for the war years, we told families, actually, if your child wants to go and work in a factory for a few years, because we need the labour and you need the cash, we're going to turn a blind eye. And we actually found the attendance dropped to 80%. And it took over a decade for that to get back to 90%. So I'm not entirely surprised that if you send everybody home for a period of time and say, go home, you'll be fine, you'll be safer there, that it is going to take some time to come back. And then you have these other social things happening on top, of which no one has yet got underneath. There are some people who say it's to do with working from home. Others say there's no evidence of that. Something about home education and a shift. Others say it's not that. So it's difficult at the moment still to unearth it.
Wow. And that's going to be really damaging over the long run for a lot of those children who are missing school, presumably.
Yes, we know that there is a direct correlation between outcomes at GCSEs and your attendance. So that is one of the most established things that we can see. Now, why that correlation happens and will those children definitely have a worse time, of course, is something we've still got to look at. There might be some children who really thrive in home education or are fine, but if they're vulnerable, they're not coming into school, they're not getting that socialisation, they're not getting their qualifications, which do make a difference in the labour market, then yes, there is a problem.
And Luke, one of the things that we have seen post-pandemic is that the very, very gradual, small reductions in social class gaps have sort of opened up again.
Absolutely. So the disadvantage gap in GCSE results and in Key Stage 2 results kind of came down a bit between 2010 and 2019. It's then kind of re-established itself over the last 3 years. And when you then look at the attendance statistics, it becomes even more concerning when you drill down into the really nitty-gritty of the detail. So you see, for example, it's like a quarter of pupils in secondary schools are persistently absent. And that's about 10%. That persistent absence is defined as missing 10% or more sessions over the year. You see that something like 4 or 5% are severely absent, so that's missing like half the school year. And then when you get down into disadvantaged pupils in secondary schools, you see like 7% of people from disadvantaged backgrounds are missing half their school year. And so that you then become concerned about what's happening with this 5-6% of pupils that are basically entirely missing school. And some of that is unauthorized absence because they're just they're skipping school. Some of that is interestingly related to authorized absences by school. And that's kind of the big part of it. And so it kind of then connects back to Laura's previous point about well-being and anxiety, because a lot of the reasons people are absent from school are recorded as health-related reasons. And that raises probably more questions than it answers, because some of that will be a bit more caution after the pandemic about people staying off school and maybe being a bit sensible. Some of that will be related to some of the mental health conditions that we're seeing rising amongst young girls and amongst young boys.
We've seen those health-related conditions becoming more problematic right across the age span. I mean, we've done lots of work on the extraordinary increase in the numbers of people claiming disability benefits. For example, in fact, we're publishing more on that in the near future. So that's sort of, I mean, we could spend the rest of this conversation talking about the aftermath of the pandemic and exactly what's happening in terms of standards in schools and well-being and so on. And those are incredibly important issues. But into this mix, we have this new schools bill being introduced. Perhaps, Laura, you could start just by outlining what is in that bill and what you think the government's trying to achieve with it.
It's a bumper bill. Schools Week looked at it and they found 39 separate policies and things that it was trying to do, which is quite large. And they run the full gamut from children being safe at home if they're being home educated, home registers, through to teacher pay, including things like school uniform. There's a policy in there about only having 3 branded school uniform items. So it's big. When you look at the speech that Bridget Phillipson gave when she introduced it to the House in the first instance, she talked about the fact that she said, if we believe that every child deserves excellence, there needs to be a minimum standard, and then everyone innovates beyond that. And the schools part of this is, from Labour's perspective, about A, standardising and guaranteeing certain standards in school, be that how teachers are trained, what curriculum the children do, what their teachers are paid. And then it's also about, for them, a return to focusing on children, she said. So trying to get back to thinking a little bit about this broader well-being.
So that's standardization. I mean, how much is that changing? Is it right that part of what Bridget Phillips is trying to address is that with academization and the freedoms that academies have, there's been a move away from standardization? And if so, is that actually something to concern us?
That's the big fight that's on at the moment. So 15 years ago, when the coalition got in, their main focus was autonomy and freedoms for the best schools. Let 1,000 flowers bloom. You should be able to, if you are a great leader, to run your school on an academy contract, as they are essentially. And as long as you're doing well for your children, you were exempt from following the national curriculum, which laid out exactly which subjects you had to do. You were free to teach, to pay your teachers on a scale as you wished. Now, in practice, most people did follow most of the national curriculum, stayed within limits on teacher pay. But it has been very important, and there have been lots of schools that have taken those freedoms, done interesting things with them, who now feel they are about to be curtailed once again because Labour wants to bring in what they would say are guarantees of certain standards.
Are they reacting to problems here? I mean, are there identifiable problems where significant numbers of academies have been doing daft things and damaging their children?
It's quite challenging as a government when one of your levers is the national curriculum. So you can write down a big list of things that you want kids to learn, and then actually 90% of secondary schools don't have to follow it. You've ended up taking it away. And the Conservatives ended up in a problem with this because they wanted to bring in a new sex and relationship education curriculum to deal with a whole variety of what they saw as social problems at the time. And then they couldn't force people to do it. So they actually did some jiggery-pokery back in 2017 with the laws to make it so that academies had to follow this. And I think that Labour are trying to preempt that problem, because if they were to come up with, there's a curriculum on the review on the cards at the moment, they're in the process of doing it. Let's say they come up with a curriculum that they believe is the right curriculum for the future. Maybe it's in line with what Luke said before about it being a skills-based curriculum. What if they were to put that on the table and then 90% of schools were to completely ignore them? That would be a problem for them from a government perspective. And actually, we do elect them to decide what happens in our schools. So I can see for them it felt like a bit of a democratic deficit. And that's the reason why I think they've tabled this.
Obviously, a key part of this bill is to curtail the freedoms of academies, which are now a very high fraction of secondary schools. What do we know about how effective academies have? I mean, has academization made a difference? Is it one of the reasons that our system has done less badly than others, or are we still uncertain about the effectiveness of moving to academies? And it might be worth just explaining for listeners exactly what academy is, because not everyone will know.
So there's only a long answer to that question. So academies effectively govern themselves. They're outside of local authority control. They don't have to follow the school teachers' pay and conditions document. They don't have to follow they can deviate to some extent from the national curriculum.
My sense is they don't use those freedoms an enormous amount.
No. So on a very basic level, they don't use their freedoms on teacher pay very, very much. They follow the conditions document quite specifically. They deviate a bit on conditions. So, for example, like hours of employment, offering different incentives. There's been a very interesting reform proposed by United Learning Trust, who are one of the bigger academy chains, about rebalancing between pay and pensions, which is quite a very interesting reform. Indeed, very sensible, but an interesting area of innovation. But by and large, they don't use their freedoms all that much. And that's kind of the interesting aspect of it. If we look at the research on the effects of academies.
So academies are taken out of local authority control. They're independently governed, usually as part of a chain.
Yeah.
And they've got a series of freedoms from curriculum and pay and so on that other schools wouldn't have. And that's broadly speaking what we're talking about when we're talking about academies. So, and the idea, I think, behind this was, as Laura was saying, that you give schools or chains more autonomy. They have a basic sort of set of standards, and then they have the capacity to innovate and really lead, and not just be told what to do by the Secretary of State or the local authority. So that's the thinking behind it. And what do we know about whether that's been effective?
The short answer is, on the very specific evidence, is it hasn't had that much effect. If you look at some of the research done by academics at LSE, then you find that academies haven't had that much effect. Well, the converter academies since 2010 haven't had that much effect on attainment. There's a kind of exception to that in that the academies that were sponsored or replacing failing schools have often been more effective. And so the ability to replace really failing schools with better management has been potentially more effective. But by and large, on a specific level, academies haven't led to huge levels of improvement. But I think there's a really, really important caveat to that. I'll always have more caveats, is that I think it's changed how the system works as a whole. And what's underappreciated is just how much freedom local authority schools have. If you compare a local authority school to a school in France or even a school in the US, they have huge amounts of freedom to spend their money how they want, who to employ, what to do in the national curriculum. They have huge amounts of freedom over. The programs of study in the national curriculum leaves huge amount of discretion to schools in terms of what they do. They can also deviate from the school teachers' pay and conditions document. What they actually have to do in law is not that much. And so I think the difference between an academy and a local authority school has kind of been fading for a number of years, just because so many more schools have been getting more freedom. And so it's hard to assess how the overall system is shifting towards autonomy, because it's basically the whole system has changed. And how you assess that from an evidence point of view is really, really hard.
Yeah, I agree. And it's why this becomes quite tricky to work out what the bill will actually do. Because an example of these freedoms that everybody has is that even where the rules say you have to do something, for example, every school in England is supposed to do collective daily worship. So they are supposed to have all the children get together and do some form of worship. We know from surveying teachers on Teacher Tapp for years now that the majority of schools do not do this. But they don't get in trouble for it. There's no sort of enforcement rule. So as Luke says, there's always been kind of quite a lot of flexibility anyway. Where there is a big change is coming back to something you said, Luke, on the sponsored schools. So where a school was failing before academies came in, it was up to the local authority to try and solve that problem. But sometimes the local authority also weren't very good at solving the problem. And then what did you do? Now, having a variety of academy trusts, these charities who sit as the kind of supra body that take the schools in and look after them, the independent governors, what that means is if one of those isn't doing very well by a school, you can take the school and give it to a different one. So there is a chance at a fresh start. And that has been quite important. And it does look like, in the case of those schools who were failing and have gone into academy trusts, that by and large they have gone on to do better. We're not saying that they wouldn't have gone on to do better if they could have moved local authority, but actually it was very difficult to do that previously. And so in the new schools bill, one of the very controversial things is that Labour are proposing that instead of having a rule which says now, if you fail your Ofsted, it will automatically be the case that you will be given an academy order and you will either become an academy or move academies. They are now saying there will be a range of interventions and it will be discretionary. Now, on the one hand, that makes sense because there are lots of different things you could do to help a school. But those who went through this 10 or 15 years ago are saying it's often very controversial when you give an academy order. And if there's any level of discretion, that can lead to a lot of legal challenges. So when you took that discretion away, it took away the ability to have the legal challenges. And so while that's quite a technical point of the schools bill, it is one of the reasons why there is such controversy over that decision.
Okay, so that's one thing that looks like it will genuinely change as a result of the schools bill, that if you've got a failing school, as it were, the way that that is dealt with will change. What will be different after all of these 39 things that you've said are part of this apparently very controversial bill?
Breakfast clubs, which I think we'll come on to later, is one part of this. So most schools will or should have a free breakfast club in future. So if you're a parent who needs to put your kid in somewhere early on, then that might be a thing that's available to you that's different than it is now.
One very specific thing, yeah.
But otherwise, on teacher pay, on the curriculum, on the fact that teachers will need to be qualified or be getting their qualification, I'm not sure we're going to see huge amounts of changes other than in the small number of schools that have taken advantage of those freedoms.
So as I understand it, if you've got an academy, your teachers don't have to be fully qualified teachers, is that right?
That's right, and Labour are looking to change that. So you would need...
But there's not many people in that position.
Neil O'Brien, the Shadow Schools Minister, in his recent blog on this said that there were 13,600 in the system. Now, that's twice as many as Labour have promised to add, 6,500 teachers, so it's not a small number. But the question is really how many of those couldn't become qualified teachers? And it will actually depend on whether or not they've got degrees in GCSEs. That's the biggest snag. When you've got someone who is absolutely fantastic at teaching a particular subject, but for whatever reason don't have GCSEs or a degree, then it's very difficult to get through.
PE teacher or something.
Yeah, it's usually music teachers, sports teachers and specific community language teachers. Now, when the law used to be in, before the Conservatives got rid of it, there were a set of exceptions and caveats. And my assumption is that through the process of this schools bill being looked at, both in the Commons and the Lords, we will probably get some of those caveats put back in.
There's two questions I have here, I mean, which are sort of the flip side of one another. It's what is the problem this bill is trying to address, and is it actually going to have any effect? I mean, it sounds like there's not an obvious problem to address, and therefore much of what's in there isn't going to make much difference. Is that fair?
I think it's getting ahead of problems. That's how Labour might see it. So, for example, on curriculum, if there's a new curriculum coming in, they don't want people saying they don't like it and not doing it. On teachers' pay, if funding continues to be constrained, the challenge around pensions that Luke mentioned, they're trying to shore up those teacher pay standards. And then the other one that's in there, a bit buried, is about pupil numbers, because the birth rate has been dropping for a number of years. This is going to cause challenges over the next 10 years. There will need to be school closures to keep schools sustainable. In order to do that, there's going to be a bit of a standoff now, because in the past, councils, when they were overseeing all schools, were able to decide which ones closed. Now, they can't open them in the past, and they've been unable to force academies to close. So there are a number of provisions in there which enable councils to open new schools. That's less likely, to be honest, but also how they're going to deal with closures and who is going to regulate school pupil numbers.
That's really important. Absolutely, you can just take us through, if you've got the broad numbers to hand, what is happening to pupil numbers, because it's something that one doesn't normally think about, that the fluctuating birth rate causes real problems for school.
No, absolutely. And the interesting about it is that you can see it as kind of like a sine wave from the baby boom after the war as well.
Sine wave? I'm not even sure I know what a sine wave is. Sorry.
So just a fluctuation and kind of echoes from the baby boom. So the children of the baby boomers they had a bit of a baby boom themselves, and then
okay.
So there's kind of like natural cycles from the population, but the pure population is dropping.
We had a conversation here with on demography a couple of months ago about the extraordinary drop in the birth rate more generally.
No, absolutely, and that's hitting primary schools first. So we're seeing a drop in primary school population up until 27, 28, and maybe further beyond as well, and that will further go into secondary schools. There's some variation around the country as well, in that we're seeing bigger drops in London, the southeast, and the northeast of England as well. So there'll be some variation of that, and as Laura says, councils will need to plan places accordingly, and so it's kind of sensible to be giving councils and forcing councils and academies to cooperate more in terms of place planning, because there will be a need to have some rationalisation, and you can't do that without some pretty hard sticks.
Yeah. So broadly speaking, that set of provisions in the bill, it sounds like, are necessary in order to make the system work. I'm presumably going to be horribly controversial every time a school does close, because parents living nearby are not going to be happy about it. But if you've got a lot fewer kids, it's going to be very, very expensive to keep them open, and you're going to have to force that through one way or another. Sort of coming again, thinking about the structure of the bill. I mean, is it changing the way that schools are held accountable? Is the accountability system changing here?
Yes. So there's two different changes. One is around the school inspectorate and Ofsted, and then one is around this academy orders and accountability aspect of it. So taking Ofsted first, that's the school inspector. At the moment, if you were to go online and look to see if a school's been inspected and look at what its grade was, up until a few months ago, you would have seen one of 4 grades. That school would either be outstanding, good, requires improvement, or inadequate. And then if the school got 1 inadequate or 2 on the bounce, requires improvements, it could be given one of those academy orders and forced to change its management. And the reports themselves are fairly loosely written for parents, so it could sometimes be a bit difficult to work out exactly what was going wrong in the school. It was felt for a long time that reducing everything that happens in a school to one word was reductive at best, and actually cruel and overly pressured on their leader. And so they've already got rid of those one-word judgments, but there was a plan to shift away from that, and the new plan is on the table now. So instead, Ofsted is going to inspect up to 11 areas across the school. There will be 5 grades, which I think now are exemplary, strong, secure, needs attention, and causing concern, and they're RAG rated. So it sounds very, very similar, I know.
So go from 4 words to 5.
To 5, exactly. And exemplary will be peer reviewed, so you can only be recommended by an inspector, but actually it will be decided by the sector who gets that. But what's more important is that every area gets its own grade. And needs intention will have to be very specific. So the inspector will need to say what it is you've got wrong, what you need to do to solve it. And they'll come back within 18 months. And if you've significantly improved, then it gets boosted back up again. And then for these serious cases where you've got reds or lots of ambers, there will be a range of different interventions. And this is the bit about accountability. In the past, Labour would argue it was a very blunt instrument. We just said, right, get an academy trust, and we'd have to go out, find one, and they would have to take you over. Instead, what they've done is hired 20 people to be in these improvement teams. They're going to hire some more to do that as well, and they will instead work with those schools to broker deals for anything that they need. So let's imagine you've got a school that's mostly okay, but really struggling with, say, its attendance and its science and its music curriculum. Instead of making it become an academy, what we could do is find them a organisation that's doing a lot on attendance, a whole variety of charities working in that field. We could get them another school up the road that's doing really well with its science and music curriculum, get them to share the curriculum over, come back in 18 months' time, and actually, if that's improved it, then we don't need to make them into an academy at all. So that's the shift that Labour are going for. It is not being warmly welcomed, I'll be honest. Before it was laid out, people seemed optimistic, yes, by the teaching profession. When we surveyed on the new Ofsted plan, only 6% of teachers were somewhat positive, and none were very positive.
Oh dear, that's not enthusiastic, is it?
No, and partly that's because when we surveyed a few months before all of this, you find that only a third of teachers believe that inspection can even happen. Right? Is it even possible for a couple of people to turn up at a school for a few days and accurately judge what was previously only a few areas and now is going to be more than 10? And so lots of people just don't believe it's possible. So I think you lose a ton of the room, whatever you do. But also, this new framework and this list of all these different areas, it's over 35 pages long. And it's all the evidence that you have to gather. And I think there's a bunch of school leaders who are looking at it thinking, gosh, that is a lot of work to do. We've got a curriculum review on the way. We've got all these other parts of the bill that we've got to bring in. We're just not sure this is going to be manageable.
So they're worried this will be more resource intensive, more heavy handed than what they've been used to, which is, they were not terribly happy with in the first place.
Exactly. And, sort of 25 years ago, probably more now, when the Labour Party were in and were doing their big turnaround in the 2000s, they did build big Ofsted inspection reports like this. They put extraordinary levels of accountability onto schools, but at the time they backed it up with extraordinary levels of support. There was money coming out of everywhere. They were sending all kinds of staff in. There was all kinds of technology. There was so much training available. This time it feels like they've tried to do the same thing again. And it could be the right framework for school improvement. But if you are putting this on top of a workforce who are already feeling the constraints of funding for the last few years, feeling very, very tired and going through a big curriculum review, it is a worry. And certainly they're not reacting particularly well to it.
And accountability, Luke, is obviously an important part of the whole school system. I mean, it's not just this, it's things like league tables and so on. And again, I think it's right in saying that there's less of this type of accountability in the other parts of the United Kingdom.
That's correct, yes. So there's less sort of hard stick accountability in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. There is some research showing that the lack of league tables in Wales led to some reductions in pupil attainment, but not very, very large and very specific parts of the ability distribution. I think the interesting thing about accountability is, and I think it's one that Laura was stressing quite well, which is these teams have only got 2 or 3 days in a school. What is the actual most useful thing that they could be doing in a school for 2 or 3 days? How do you want them to spend their time? Do you want them to spend looking through portfolios of documents that someone's had to spend 30, 40, 50, 60, well, maybe more hours than that putting together? Or do you want them interacting with the classroom and trying to work out what the most useful contribution they can make to that school's improvement is? I'm not sure what the answer is to that. I think the one-word judgments were quite blunt. I think I fail to see how a team of inspectors is going to reach an informed and widely commanded and externally valid view on 10 areas of inspection. It's just going to be impossible. And so I think it's kind of, what do we do with constrained resources and how do we use them most usefully?
This feels like the sort of, I used to work in the education department 25 years ago. It does feel like the sort of thing that's easy to sort of dream up in Whitehall as you kind of you think of this and you think of that, and it goes through various committees and processes and you make it bigger and you've got to cover everything. And then when it actually hits the front line, I think, oh my God, this doesn't really reflect the reality we're working in.
And in fairness to Ofsted, they've put out a big consultation document. They'd already just done a big listen. I think they are committed to listening to consultation. They're doing trials in a few hundred schools over the next few months to try and see how this works out. They've got teams looking at reliability, validity. I think they are doing as much as they can to get over those problems. But there is an inherent question of whether or not it's the right thing to do. And of course, in Wales, they've simply said, we're just not going to take part in this kind of thing anymore.
I found that very interesting. So I'm a governor at our children's local school in Wales, and they had a inspection. And the governor's discussion about, I don't think I'm revealing anything secretive here, but the governor's discussion about it, it was all in text. And we had to go through the text and try and work out whether it was a good report or a bad report. We generally view it as a good report. But then the school worked quite hard to try and summarize it by drawing out quotes from the report saying this is why this was a really, really good report. And it kind of felt like the school was doing the job of what government and Ofsted should be doing in terms of trying to work out what is the most effective way to summarize our investigation into the school for the last 2 or 3 days. And that's a really hard thing to do. Summarizing things effectively is hard. And
it is. I spent half my life doing it.
Well, exactly. But it's always a balance between detail and what people need to know.
Yeah, and it's a shame that the inspectors don't do that themselves, because that, as you say, would be what would be really useful. As Laura says, this is a bill of many parts, and we've already sort of briefly mentioned one of the things that perhaps people will be most familiar with. It's in the Labour manifesto. People will get their hands around this. Breakfast clubs. So what are they going to be?
So the governor's committed to having free breakfast clubs in all primary schools. And so that's extending the national breakfast programme that exists at the moment. And they're having a few trials in the way they operate that. And it'll mostly be around providing a free breakfast at the start of the day for about 45 minutes or something like that. But the funding is relatively low. So it's around 75 pence per pupil breakfast. Is that about right, Laura? Something in that mark, 60p.
And that probably covers the toast, but not necessarily the people to look after.
No, so it's relatively cheap and cheerful. And the evidence suggests it probably improves attainment a little bit, might improve attendance a bit, but it's certainly not transformational. So to have it as your flagship policy seems a little bit odd.
People understand it and like it, yeah.
Food for children is a wildly popular policy. As someone who has sat on Newsnight and argued that perhaps we shouldn't have given free lunches to every child under the age of 7, I know exactly how hard it is to try and say anything negative about these kind of policies. So it's wildly popular because people understand it, and it inherently is a good thing to give food to children. We know from when we were surveying...
Better than starving them, I suppose.
Well, look, Margaret Thatcher, she learnt to her detriment.
Well, do you know, I think I was one of the very last cohorts who actually had some free milk, which then disappeared.
The free milk is still a thing that people are talking about, and that was got rid of in the early 1970s. There's not much that stays with people viscerally in this, but they're wildly popular. When we surveyed teachers before Labour got in on all of their manifesto pledges, we did a comparative rating, and it was one of the top 3. It is hard for schools to do in some ways because there is the funding, there is the logistics, there is the staffing, but only about 25% of schools had no breakfast clubs at all when we last surveyed on this in 2022. So most of them have some level of infrastructure already in. The challenge is that a bunch of primary schools have been charging for this. So story this week in Schools Week of a head teacher who charges £2.50 for the hour in the morning, has a sports teacher who runs it with the kids, and he reckons he's going to lose about £9,000 a year when this switches over to being free. And I think that is the sorts of challenges we're going to see coming up with this.
£2.50 for an hour's childcare sounds pretty good for me.
Good deal for you, good deal for them, exactly.
That's obviously one of the sort of headline things, and we've talked about some of the accountability issues and so on. 39 different things. Is there anything else that we ought to cover, Laura, before we kind of come to an end? I mean, without delving into the details that are not going to be much interest to anyone.
To me, when this comes up, honestly, I think what most people from the school system need is everything else to be fixed. That's actually why I will sometimes make the case against giving free things to kids that have already got food in favour of doing other stuff. Because actually, I think the biggest barriers now to social mobility, to children's wellbeing, lie outside of schools. Housing, poverty, labour markets, dentistry. Hard to learn at school when your parents can't take you to the dentist and your mouth is absolutely, stunking with pain. If that social support is not available and those other things are not solved, schools will go a long way. Like, we are holding up as a sector tons of other things that have fallen apart, but schools can't keep doing it on their own. So I'm glad there's things happening in education. Great, we can hammer things around the edges, but Labour need to be getting on with many more things in order to solve the social mobility mission.
I mean, I think that is a sort of broader concern. I mean, it's easy, isn't it, to sell these shiny new things, whether they be breakfast clubs or actually, much more comprehensive childcare. And you can see why everyone likes that. But in a world where the stuff you're already delivering is, or trying to deliver, isn't doing so well, it's not obvious that you want to be building more and more legs onto the welfare state, given the ones that they're already crumbling a bit. Luke, what's your sort of reflection on the extent to which what's in the schools bill will try and deal with some of the big problems that we've talked about, attendance, social mobility, children's welfare?
So I think the short answer is I don't think it changes very much. And it kind of prepares for some of the arguments they're going to be having in the future around the curriculum and around place planning. It doesn't really change the education system all that much. And as Laura said, I think some of the major challenges come outside the system. And to some extent, I think some school leaders would probably, well, they wouldn't tell you this directly, but they'd probably tell you under their breath they prefer money to go into other parts of public services rather than go into schools, so that they could not have to fix problems before they come into school. So I think that's the kind of position where we're at. I'm kind of a bit more optimistic about the future for the ability of the education system to improve, parking the huge problems about people's coming to school not quite ready. I think the structure of it works quite well. And it comes back to the point I was making about earlier about maintained schools and academies all having lots of freedoms, is that we have quite a contestable system. To go back to the theory of contestability, if a part of the system is failing, it can be changed quite quickly. Whilst if I compare in Wales and Scotland, if a school is failing, there isn't that whole lot that much that will change. So we do have the ability to make quite big change in the system. We also have a teaching profession that is quite well skilled. One of the interesting things is that the teachers have kind of taken ownership of teaching methods, which is kind of understandable, but is it just how much ownership they've taken of it is really quite remarkable. And you have a number of superstar teachers across the system in England that are spreading best practice in quite an effective way. And so I kind of feel if they change the curriculum a bit to make it a bit broader, the structures are there to deliver quite a lot of improvement.
So we've had this conversation. I mean, what I take away from it is what's in this bill is certainly not going to be transformational. It's going to make some tweaks here and there. It's going to insist on more conformity, but where there, largely speaking, is quite a lot of conformity. I mean, what is irritating the sector about it? Is it the sort of the sense that we might not be using very much of these freedoms, but we like the fact that we're trusted to do so? Is it that even it might not be much being used, where they're really valued? Is it that this is just going to, in their view, create an awful lot more work and headaches for not much positive outcome? Is it a combination of all of those things?
I mean, I don't think the bill as a whole is completely annoying everybody. I think that there are academy trust leaders are the ones who are concerned about the standardization. Actually, for the teachers, I suspect, I'm trying to think what our specific surveys are, but I think they're probably, lots of them were very positive about the idea of the national curriculum being national when we were surveying on it during the manifesto pledges. When we asked them, do you want to work in a local authority school or a multi-academy trust, all things being equal, it's still massively in favour of local authorities. So actually on the ground amongst classroom teachers, there's not as much love for those freedoms as you might think on Ofsted, it's the workload. And there's also the fact that at the moment, the funding situation, the pupil numbers, and we won't go into it in detail, but the large increase in special educational needs and the cost of that has just put a lot of pressure on the system. And so I think this bill isn't addressing the things that they feel are the very big explosive issues, along with the child poverty, the housing and everything else. So that's why it just feels a bit deck chair arranging, but that doesn't mean they all dislike it.
I think that's really interesting, maybe the right place to end this fantastic conversation. I've certainly learned a huge amount about the schools bill, and I think what I take from it is that it's kind of, to some extent, missing the point in terms of the big issues that are facing the system. Probably not going to do any great harm, but probably won't make any great positive difference. Otherwise, we can see the politics behind it in terms of breakfast clubs and why giving, was it 70p a day or 70p a week?
That's a good question.
I think it's 60p a day.
60p a day. 60p a day for breakfast. You can see might be a bit difficult to deliver, but looks like a nice extra bit of free stuff for parents. And my kids are much too old to benefit from that, but I would certainly have appreciated it 20 years ago. This is, as you say, a big bill. I suspect this be the flagship education or schools bill that we get in this Parliament. I suppose we may look back on it as a little bit of a non-event and a wasted or a lost opportunity, but we will wait and see what the outcome of that is. But let's end on some of those positive notes that the sector as a whole is not up in arms against it, I don't think, from what Laura's been saying, which is perhaps more positive than you read in some of the press. The sector as a whole has been doing pretty well, certainly relative to other bits of public services over the last period, although we cannot take our eyes away from the real issues around the welfare of children and some of these issues around special educational needs and around attendance. And I think one of the frustrations is this bill doesn't seem really to be tackling those really big issues. But anyway, as I say, I think we will end the conversation there. My enormous thanks, particularly to Laura, to coming in and speaking, and to Luke, who is, of course, one of ours. And thank you all for listening to this episode of the IFS Zooms In. To see more of our work, please do visit www.ifs.org.uk. And to further support us, please do consider becoming a member for as little as £10 a month. You can find out more in the episode description. We will see you next time.